Thanks for the invitation to the forum. I think it's timely, and the issues that you put together are good ones. As you said, the situation continues to unfold, and there's a lot that's been said about what can be done now in the current crisis around conflict sensitivity, rearranging funding schemes, and shifting peacebuilding efforts to accompany health directives. But the crisis also highlights that threats come not only from states and non-state actors, but also from health issues and threats to livelihood. And this really should inform the kinds of tools that the EU and other actors should be developing to be able to respond. It's a challenging time, I think, for many, many people. The pandemic has further revealed the structural inequalities. The virus is not the great equalizer that people were talking about initially. As was mentioned previously, the vulnerable are more vulnerable. So is this an opportunity to find ways to address the sanitary crisis and inequalities, racism and sexism together intentionally? Is it possible to find ways to increase social cohesion and to not promote othering? In some places, states are using the pandemic to curb political, civic, and sexual rights and freedoms and to oppress dissenters and nonconformists. I imagine that's come up a lot today because it's quite obvious. And there's a substantial impact that's been noted on women in terms of economic stress, enclosure of civic space, and increased burden of care. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is that there will be an aftermath, and there'll be a response that's going to be needed over the long term as a result of what's happened over the past few months. Peacebuilding organizations are in a tough situation where they've had to carry out activities quite differently, but it's also a time for innovation. So we've seen peacebuilders testing new solutions like the online connections and working through media channels. There's work being done to respond in light of those that were able to help in the Ebola on communication and relationships and social cohesion and what was learned from that. There's also organizations in the mediation sphere that are working to support and monitor the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. It's an aside, but I think when we're looking at lessons learned about what to do differently, it's interesting to note that the failure to get the Security Council endorsement of the Secretary General's, I think, quite innovative and bold declaration for a ceasefire just shows how difficult it can be to do the right thing. And what it takes, the struggle that it takes for change. So yes, this is the great stress test on the multinational system, on all the way down to the individual human's lives. We can't assume that that will automatically create new habits for change. It's going to have to be intentional. Peacebuilding organizations will need investment and they'll need support to be able to pull through the crisis and to be ready and fully operational on the other side. The economic situation that maybe it's been alluded to for sure, but because I think it's so dramatic and we don't have the figures, I'll gloss over it, but we were very much anticipating that it's going to have a large impact on not only how much money is available for organizations in this line of work, but also how populations perceive the actions and the funding. On the European side, of course, we're waiting for the next multi-annual financial framework to be revealed, and this will tell us a lot about what and where the EU intends to invest resources in the post-COVID-19 world. I think in terms of lessons learned to be able to move forward, can we plan for peace like we plan for war? Can we have the scenarios? Can we have the resources? Can we be planning for the day after? This peacebuilding organizations are going to have quite a bit of work depending on how this is carried out. It's not a given that it's going to increase the divisions between populations and governments, but we can look at that. We can already see what's happening now. In terms of the nexus that was mentioned earlier, it's been fairly operational in some countries, more on the humanitarian and the development side. The peace side has been debated, and it's been, there are policies that are being developed to better flesh out what that means, but in practice, it tends to be the one that gets dropped kind of first out of the three. So looking at how can there be sort of planned, joined up methodologies for assessment, planning, programming, and results frameworks in advance of crises to promote effective and joined up responses across the nexus, making sure that peace is really integrated into the other two pillars. And I think particularly in this instance, we're talking about conflict sensitivity, gender sensitivity, inclusive design of programmings for the rapid response actions. We know these have to be developed in advance. It all moves too quickly. Another is to, I think, particularly for the European Union, to not forget it to focus and to continue to ensure that civil society is recognized as key partners and that human security remains the goal of interventions. We could look towards the EU-Africa relations and the discussions that will take place at the, if it's still on, if my latest information is correct, on the October summit. Where is civil society in that, so that it doesn't become a, sort of state support uniquely, and that the message and the focus and the intention continues to be about the people that are in these societies and their human security. I think also looking ahead to 2020, at least 22 countries in Africa will be organizing polls, 13 of which will be for president or prime minister. How the EU engages in challenging, do you hold them? Do you postpone the elections in the circumstances? How do you prevent election-related violence or the erosion or the possible erosion of democratic governance? So there's elections are an easy one when it comes to conflict prevention, to be able to pinpoint a precise event, what can be done before, during, and after. So it is an interesting one to focus on, but here we know what's going to be happening, at least to look at. I think if we can pause and reflect, comparing and contrasting what's happened over the last few months, we can look at how to better support fragile and conflict-affected countries. Can we improve basic human security? There's a continued investment on the part of the EU and others in many of the countries in the Sahel, was mentioned earlier. A lot of eggs going in the basket of security from perhaps a protected defense perspective, containing migration, but also on countering violent extremism. Much of that needs to be also balanced with promotion of human security and basic needs of populations. What is it going to take to have resilient societies? So this should be, I think, an opportunity to again reflect the limitations of those approaches. So if it is that there's going to be an investment in the training of troops, the paying of salaries of troops, or the equipping, perhaps, as the EU is planning to try to do under the European Peace Facility. What problems will that solve, and what holes does that leave? And where's the short term on this and the long term? But we know peace-building organizations are gearing up to be able to do the work that they do on the ground. After this, if money is dispersed quite quickly to help, there'll be a lot of checks and balances that aren't in place. And so there's going to be a need for an emphasis on, again, the people that we know who are most vulnerable, who regrettably are the ones that end up being hit the hardest.